The horses were watching the pass when Walter Boone came over the top of it, and not one of them was afraid, and that was the thing he could never explain for the rest of his life. He had hunted the country north of the Yellowstone for 9 years. He knew its ridges and its water, and the way the light fell across it in the late part of the year. And he carried the shape of that land in his head, the way other men carry the streets of the town they were born in. So, when he crested the last rise of a box canyon that his maps did not show and his memory did not hold, and saw a valley open below him that he had never once seen, he stopped his horse, and he sat very still, because a man who knows his country does not expect it to hand him something new. The valley was green in a dry September. It was watered when the rest of the high country had gone to dust and brittle grass, and it ran for miles between its walls, and it was full of horses. There were hundreds of them, more than he could count from where he sat, grazing and standing and moving in loose bands across a valley floor that stretched further than his eye could follow. And every horse near enough to see the man on the skyline had lifted its head and turned to face the pass, ears forward, still unafraid. Wild horses did not do that. Walter had run mustangs, and he had watched mustangs for the better part of his life, and he knew that a wild band's first answer to a man on the skyline is to run, to put ground and terrain between themselves and the thing that has appeared above them. These horses did not run. They watched him the way a horse in a corral watches a man it knows come walking to the fence. And there was no corral, and they did not know him, and there were hundreds of them. And Walter Boone sat his horse at the top of the pass and felt the hair rise on his arms beneath his coat. His partner, Frank Callahan, came up beside him and stopped, and looked down into the valley and said nothing for a long time. Frank had been in the mountains longer than Walter, and he had learned to hold his tongue until he had looked long enough to be sure of what he was looking at. Then Frank said, quiet, that those horses were broke. Walter said they could not be broke. Nobody had ever been in this valley. There was no trail down that he could see and no trail in. Frank said he knew it, and they were broke all the same. Look at them, he said. That was not the way a wild band stands. That was the way a using horse stands, when it has been turned out to grass and a rider comes across the field to catch it up. And there was no rider. There were hundreds of horses standing as though they were waiting to be caught, and there was not one living soul in the valley to catch them. So they rode down. The descent took the better part of an hour, down a game trail so faint that Walter doubted men had ever set foot on it, and the horses watched them come the whole of the way. When the two men reached the valley floor, the nearest band did not scatter. The horses shifted a little, made room, kept the polite distance that broke stock keeps when it gives way to a rider, and went on watching. And now close, Walter saw what Frank had seen from the pass. These were not the scrubby, wiry mustangs of the high plains. These were horses of every kind and every quality a man could name. Cavalry bays with the deep chest of animals, bred to carry weight into hard places. Draft horses, heavy and calm. Cow ponies with the muscle of long use laid across their shoulders. Fine saddle horses of a breeding that had no business standing loose in a hidden valley in the Montana wilderness. Old horses and young horses and horses in the full prime of their strength. All of them together. All of them turned to face the two living men who had come down among them. And on many of them, as Walter rode close, he saw the marks of ownership. Brands, worn and old. And on more than a few, the pale galled lines where a saddle had once ridden, and a cinch had once drawn tight, long-heeled now, but there, plain, for a man who knew to look. These horses had been ridden. Every one of them, or near every one, had once been somebody's horse. And here they were in a valley no man had entered, hundreds of them waiting. Walter asked Frank to read some of the brands. Frank knew brands the way Walter knew country. It was a stockman's whole education, and Frank had it deep. He rode among them slow, reading for a long time, and then he came back to Walter with his face gone careful. In the way that Walter had learned over the years meant Frank had found a thing he did not want to have found. Frank said he had read 40 brands. He knew 11 of them, and every one of the 11 he knew was a horse that was dead. Walter asked him what he meant by dead. Frank said he meant that he knew these outfits and that he had heard tell over the years of a horse from each of these brands that had been lost or had run off, or had been stolen and never recovered, or that a man had been riding when the man went under and the horse was never found after. That grey there with the 7-bar L, that was Tom Halloran's horse, or the very spit of it, and Tom went through the ice on the Musselshell in the winter of 1882, and they never found the man, nor the horse. That bay with the rocking M, that was the pattern of a horse the Mullins outfit lost with a rider 3 years back. The rider they found. The horse they never did. Every brand he knew, Frank said, on a horse in this valley was a brand off a horse that had gone missing with a man, or had gone missing in a place where a man went missing. These were the horses of the dead, Frank said, or the horses of the lost. Every one of them had belonged to somebody who was not riding anymore. Walter looked around the valley at the hundreds of horses standing in the September grass and watching 2 living men move slowly among them, and something came up in him from below his own thinking, and he understood what Frank was telling him, and he understood what the valley was. He told Frank they needed to ride out of there. Frank said yes. They did. But before they went, Walter did a thing he could never afterward explain and never once regretted. He stepped down off his horse in the middle of that valley, among the horses of the dead and the lost, and he stood there in the grass, and the nearest of them came to him. It was a dun mare, old, gentle, with a brand on her hip that Frank had not been able to read, worn too far to make out. She came to Walter the way a horse comes to a man it trusts, and she put her head against his chest, and Walter stood and held her head against him for a while, and then he stepped back and got up on his horse, and he and Frank rode up out of the valley the way they had come down into it. At the top of the pass, Walter turned and looked back. The horses were still watching. The dun mare had walked a little way after them and stopped, and she was watching too. Walter raised his hand to them, to all of them, the way a man raises his hand to people he is leaving behind, and then he rode over the pass and out of the valley, and he never found it again, though he looked for it, on and off, for the next 31 years. He and Frank made camp that night 10 miles east, and neither of them slept much. In the morning, Frank said the thing they had both been turning over in the dark. He said he had been thinking on it, on the horses standing broke and unafraid and waiting to be caught up. He said he believed they were waiting for their riders, that the valley was the place where the horses of the lost go, the ones that went missing with a man, or in a place a man was lost, and that they go there and they wait and they do not run from a rider on the skyline because they are hoping every time that the rider on the skyline is the one they have been waiting for. And they had let 2 strangers ride down and move among them, and they had not run, because for as long as it took them to see the faces come close, they had believed that these might be theirs, come back at last. Walter did not answer for a while. Then he said that the dun mare had come to him. She had come to him like she knew him, and he did not own a dun mare, and never had lost one. But she came to him like he was hers. Frank looked at his partner a long moment. He said maybe she was only an old mare that liked people, or maybe she had been waiting so long she would take any man's kindness for the man she was waiting for. He said he did not know how any of it worked. He knew they had ridden into a valley full of the horses of dead men, and the horses had been glad to see them. And then they had not been. And he knew that he wanted to ride east until they were a long way from that place, and he knew that he was never going back. They rode east. Frank Callahan never did go back, and he never spoke of the valley to a living soul but Walter, and he died in the year 1899, in a line shack near Big Timber. An old man, alone. The men who found him said his horse was standing at the door of the shack and would not leave it. And they said that when they came to take the horse, it went with them quiet, and that it was an old dun mare that none of them knew, carrying no brand that any of them could read. Walter Boone heard about that when they came to tell him Frank was dead. He did not say anything. He went to the place where they had put Frank in the ground, and he stood there a while, and then he asked the men who had found him what had become of the dun mare, and they told him she had wandered off in the night from the corral where they had turned her out, and that she had left no tracks. Walter Boone nodded, and he did not ask anything more. He looked for the valley 31 times across 31 years, and he never found it again. He went back into the country north of the Yellowstone in the spring, when the water ran high and the passes showed themselves, and he went back in the dry part of the year, when the high grass burned brown and a green valley would have stood out from the hills around it like a lamp in a dark window. He rode the box canyons and he cut for the faint game trail he had followed down, And some years he came close enough to feel the country turn familiar under him, and then it would go strange again, and there would be no valley, and no horses, and no pass that looked down on either one. He learned the shape of that whole quarter of the territory better than any living man, and it never gave the valley back to him, and after a time he came to understand that it was not going to, and he grew old. And in the year 1907, being 70 years old and knowing he was near the end of his road, he told the whole of it to his son, and told him to write it down and keep it in the family and never to put it in print. "I have looked for that valley for 31 years, he told his son, "and I understand now that I was never going to find it, and I understand why, and it is not a hard thing to understand once a man is old enough. The valley is not for the living. It let Frank and me in the one time because it took us, for a moment, for the riders it had been waiting for, and when it saw that we were not, it let us go, because it is not cruel, and it had no use for us. A living man cannot go back to it, because a living man has no horse waiting there. The valley only opens to a man whose horse is already in it. I have come to believe," he told his son, "that when I die, if I have kept faith with the things a man ought to keep faith with, I will find that valley one more time, and there will be a horse in it, standing broke and unafraid, watching the pass, waiting for me. And it will be a horse I loved and lost, or a horse that carried me somewhere that mattered, and I will come over the top of the pass, and it will lift its head and know my face, and I will not have to look for the valley any more. And I have come to believe," he said, "that the dun mare that came to me in the year 1876, and that stood at Frank's door when he died and would not leave it, and that wandered off in the night and left no tracks, I have come to believe she was waiting for the both of us, that she came to me that once to tell me she was there, and that I need not be afraid of dying, and that she went to Frank at the end to carry him where he was going, and that she will come for me too when it is my time, and I am not afraid. Tell your children this," he told his son, "and their children after them. When a man who has ridden all his life comes to the end of it, there is a horse waiting for him that he loved, in a valley the living cannot find, and the horse is not afraid, and it is not lost, and it knows his face." Frank Callahan rode out of that valley beside me in the year 1876, and a dun mare carried him back into it in the year 1899. And I have spent the 8 years since not afraid of dying, because I know now what is waiting in the valley, and it is only a good horse standing in the grass watching the pass, glad to see me come.